November 12, 1944. The gray waters of Leyte Gulf shimmer under the harsh Philippine sun as LST-464 cuts through the swells, her flat bottom riding heavy with wounded men. Inside her converted medical bay, the air hangs thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp sting of ether. Surgical instruments gleam under harsh electric lights as Dr. James Morrison bends over an operating table, his steady hands working to extract shrapnel from a young sailor's chest. Above deck, the ship's lookouts scan the horizon through binoculars, their eyes searching for the telltale glint of incoming aircraft. The war has taken a deadly turn in recent weeks. Japanese kamikaze pilots have begun deliberately targeting American vessels, turning their planes into guided missiles of flesh and steel. At 13:47 hours, the alarm klaxon cuts through the humid air like a knife. Air raid, all hands to battle stations. The ship lurches as her engines roar to full power, but Dr. Morrison doesn't even look up from his patient. His scalpel continues its precise work as the LST's anti-aircraft guns begin their thunderous barrage overhead. Around him, nurses and corpsmen steady themselves against the bulkheads, maintaining their grip on surgical instruments and plasma bottles. This is what Japanese officers never expected to witness. American medical teams performing life-saving surgery even as enemy aircraft dove toward their ships with murderous intent. The Pacific War had fundamentally changed the nature of naval combat by 1944. Unlike the static trench warfare of the previous World War, this conflict demanded unprecedented mobility and medical innovation. American forces found themselves fighting across thousands of miles of ocean, where traditional evacuation methods simply couldn't reach wounded sailors and Marines in time to save their lives. The United States Navy recognized this challenge early and began developing revolutionary medical solutions. Traditional hospital ships, painted white with large red crosses, offered excellent facilities but remained vulnerable targets that had to stay far from active combat zones. What military planners needed were medical platforms that could operate directly within battle areas, treating casualties while under fire. The answer came in the form of converted landing ship tanks, or LSTs. These ungainly vessels, nicknamed large, slow targets by their crews, possessed unique characteristics that made them ideal floating hospitals. Their flat bottoms allowed them to beach directly on hostile shores. Their cavernous tank decks could be converted into surgical suites, and their gray paint and armament meant they could defend themselves while providing medical care. LST-464 became the prototype for this new breed of combat medical vessel. Commissioned in 1943, she underwent extensive modifications that transformed her into a floating trauma center. Her tank deck was divided into surgical suites, recovery wards, and specialized treatment areas. X-ray equipment, sterilization units, and even a blood bank were installed in spaces originally designed for Sherman tanks and ammunition. The medical staff aboard these vessels represented a new breed of military physician. Unlike their counterparts on traditional hospital ships, these doctors and nurses had to be prepared to perform complex surgical procedures while their ship maneuvered under enemy fire. They developed techniques for maintaining surgical sterility during combat, learned to operate while the deck pitched and rolled beneath their feet, and mastered the art of continuing life-saving procedures even as explosions rocked their vessel. By late 1944, the American medical system in the Pacific had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. Forward surgical teams could now operate within miles of active combat zones, treating casualties with a speed and efficiency that astounded both allies and enemies. Wounded men who would have died waiting for evacuation to rear-area hospitals now had their lives saved by surgeons working under the thunder of naval guns. The statistics spoke for themselves. LST-464 alone treated over 8,000 patients during her service, performing more than 1,000 major operations. Survival rates for combat casualties reached levels that seemed impossible just years earlier. American medical innovation was not just saving individual lives, it was fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the Pacific War. Japanese military doctrine had no equivalent to these floating surgical centers. Their medical philosophy emphasized stoic acceptance of death over aggressive life-saving measures. This cultural divide would soon create profound shock among Japanese officers when they witnessed American medical capabilities firsthand. Japanese military medical philosophy in 1944 reflected centuries of samurai tradition that viewed death in battle as the ultimate honor. The Bushido Code emphasized spiritual strength over physical preservation, and this mentality permeated At every level of the Imperial Japanese military medical system, Japanese commanders allocated minimal resources to battlefield medicine, believing that extensive medical care demonstrated weakness and undermined fighting spirit. The contrast with American medical philosophy couldn't have been more stark. Where Japanese doctrine accepted casualties as inevitable, American military leaders viewed every wounded soldier as a valuable asset worth saving. The United States had invested enormous resources in developing the most advanced military medical system in history, driven by the fundamental belief that preserving the lives of trained personnel provided strategic advantage. Japanese medical personnel operated under severe equipment shortages and philosophical constraints that limited their effectiveness. Their medical units received lower priority for supplies, transportation, and personnel compared to combat formations. Many Japanese medics served without adequate surgical instruments, anesthetics, or even basic wound dressings. The concept of performing complex surgery during active combat was virtually unknown in Japanese military practice. This disparity extended to the treatment of prisoners and wounded enemies. Japanese military culture viewed captured enemy personnel with contempt, considering them dishonored by their failure to die in battle. The idea that an enemy would dedicate significant resources to saving the lives of Japanese prisoners seemed incomprehensible to most imperial officers. American medical doctrine, conversely, required the treatment of all wounded personnel regardless of nationality. This policy stemmed not just from humanitarian principles but from practical intelligence-gathering considerations. Healthy prisoners provided more useful information than dying ones, and demonstrating medical competence often encouraged enemy surrender. The logistical implications of these different approaches became apparent as the war progressed. American forces maintained elaborate medical supply chains that delivered everything from penicillin to surgical instruments directly to combat zones. Mobile surgical units could establish operating theaters within hours of landing on hostile beaches. Blood banks collected and distributed plasma across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese forces, meanwhile, struggled with basic medical supplies as their logistics network crumbled under sustained American attack. Their medical personnel often improvised with captured enemy equipment, finding American medical technology far superior to their own limited supplies. Many Japanese soldiers suffered from preventable diseases and infections that American medics treated routinely. The psychological impact of these medical capabilities extended far beyond the operating theater. American troops fought with the confidence that came from knowing excellent medical care awaited them if wounded. Japanese soldiers, aware of their medical system's limitations, faced battle with the expectation that serious wounds meant certain death. This fundamental difference in medical philosophy would soon collide with brutal reality as American and Japanese forces engaged in increasingly desperate combat across the Pacific. Japanese officers, trained to expect death rather than medical salvation, were about to witness medical capabilities that challenged their basic understanding of warfare itself. From a human perspective, the men and women serving aboard American medical vessels represented a unique breed of warrior healers. Dr. Arthur White, senior medical officer aboard USS Lexington during the Battle of Coral Sea, embodied this dual nature. When Japanese torpedo bombers struck his ship, White was thrown 10 feet against a bulkhead, fracturing his shoulder and suffering severe lacerations. Despite his injuries, he remained at his station, directing the evacuation of casualties while explosions erupted throughout the ship. His dedication exemplified the personal courage required of combat medical personnel. The nurses serving on these vessels faced particular challenges that tested both their professional skills and personal resolve. When USS Comfort was struck by a kamikaze pilot near Okinawa, Chief Nurse Lieutenant Ruth Howard was blown off her feet by the explosion. The attack killed 6 nurses and 4 surgeons instantly, destroying the ship's main surgical facilities. Howard, despite losing her hearing and suffering spinal injuries, refused orders to abandon ship. She continued caring for wounded patients even as rescue teams searched the wreckage, embodying the unwavering commitment that characterized American medical personnel. Tactically, the integration of surgical capabilities into combat vessels revolutionized battlefield medicine. Traditional military doctrine separated medical and combat functions, with wounded personnel evacuated to rear area hospitals for treatment. American Innovation emanated this separation, creating hybrid vessels that could fight and heal simultaneously. LSTH-464 successfully defended herself against kamikaze attacks on November 17, 24 and 26, 1944, while simultaneously performing life-saving surgery on wounded personnel. The tactical advantages extended beyond immediate medical care. Ships equipped with surgical facilities could remain in combat zones longer, as their crews didn't require evacuation for minor injuries. Command structures remained intact because wounded officers could receive treatment without leaving their units. Most importantly, these vessels could treat casualties from multiple ships, serving as mobile medical hubs that enhanced the combat effectiveness of entire task forces. Technologically, American medical ships represented cutting-edge innovation adapted for combat conditions. The conversion of LST tank decks into surgical suites required ingenious engineering solutions. Shock-mounted operating tables prevented surgical instruments from shifting during combat maneuvers. Specialized lighting systems continued functioning even when the ship lost main power. Ventilation systems filtered out cordite smoke and maintained sterile conditions despite battle damage. The blood banking capabilities of these vessels demonstrated American technological sophistication. LST H-464 collected over 2,300 pints of whole blood during her Pacific service, creating a mobile blood bank that served Army and Navy units across the region. Refrigeration systems preserved plasma for weeks despite tropical heat and combat conditions. This technological advantage proved crucial in treating severe trauma cases that would have been fatal without immediate blood transfusions. From a leadership perspective, American naval commanders had to balance competing priorities while making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Captain John Phillips, commanding officer of USS Neosho during the Coral Sea battle, faced an impossible choice when Japanese dive bombers attacked his oil tanker. With his ship listing and burning, Phillips ordered his crew to prepare for abandonment while simultaneously directing medical personnel to continue treating casualties. His decision to send boats back to collect survivors demonstrated the leadership philosophy that prioritized human life even in desperate circumstances. The medical leadership aboard these vessels required unique qualifications that combined clinical expertise with military command skills. These medical officers had to make instant decisions about resource allocation while under enemy fire. They determined which patients could be stabilized for evacuation and which required immediate surgery despite the dangers. Their leadership often meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of wounded personnel. Enemy perspectives on American medical capabilities evolved dramatically as the war progressed. Early in the conflict, Japanese officers viewed American medical efforts with skepticism, interpreting them as signs of weakness and cultural softness. They believed that excessive concern for casualties indicated poor fighting spirit and undermined combat effectiveness. This perception began changing as Japanese personnel witnessed American medical capabilities firsthand. Japanese prisoners of war expressed astonishment at the quality of medical care they received from American personnel. Many had expected execution or torture based on their military indoctrination. Instead, they found themselves receiving the same high-quality surgical care as American casualties. This treatment created profound psychological impacts that challenged their fundamental beliefs about enemy character and military values. The moral implications of performing surgery under fire raised complex ethical questions that medical personnel had to resolve in real time. Traditional medical ethics emphasized the physician's primary obligation to preserve life regardless of external circumstances. Combat conditions created situations where continuing surgery might endanger additional lives, including medical personnel and other patients. American medical officers generally chose to continue life-saving procedures even under enemy attack, accepting personal risk to fulfill their professional obligations. These moral decisions had strategic implications that extended far beyond individual cases. Japanese forces monitoring American radio communications learned that enemy medical personnel would risk their lives to save wounded Japanese prisoners. This knowledge gradually eroded Japanese fighting morale as soldiers realized they might survive capture rather than face certain death. The moral authority demonstrated by American medical personnel became a psychological weapon that contributed to eventual Japanese surrender. The ethical framework governing American military medicine also influenced post-war reconstruction efforts. Japanese medical professionals exposed to American techniques and philosophies during the occupation began adopting more aggressive life-saving approaches in their own practice. This cultural exchange helped transform Japanese medical education and practice in ways that benefited both military and civilian populations for decades after the war ended. The morning of May 8, 1942, marked a pivotal moment in naval medical history as USS Lexington fought for survival in the Coral Sea. Japanese torpedo bombers had scored direct hits on the carrier's port side, flooding compartments and igniting aviation gasoline vapors that created a floating inferno. In the ship's medical bay, Commander Arthur White and his team faced an unprecedented challenge, performing emergency surgery while their vessel burned around them. At 12:47 hours, a massive explosion rocked the ship as leaking gasoline ignited. The blast threw Dr. White 10 feet through a passageway, fracturing his shoulder and causing severe lacerations. Around him, medical personnel struggled to maintain their footing as the ship listed heavily to port. Despite his injuries, White immediately ordered his staff to don gas masks and continue treating casualties. The scene was surreal, surgeons operating by emergency lighting while smoke poured through ventilation systems and explosions echoed through the hull. Pharmacist's mate second-class Virgil Weeks exemplified the courage of enlisted medical personnel during this crisis. As casualties were evacuated to the flight deck, Weeks helped render first aid with complete disregard for his personal safety. Explosions erupted throughout the ship, sending shrapnel flying through passages where he worked. When the abandoned ship order came, Weeks continued helping evacuate wounded personnel onto life rafts until shrapnel killed him instantly. The loss of Lexington created shockwaves throughout the Japanese command structure. Intelligence reports indicated that American medical personnel had continued operating until the final moments, prioritizing patient care over personal survival. This behavior contradicted Japanese expectations about enemy character and military discipline. How could a supposedly decadent culture produce such dedication under extreme conditions? 2 years later, the Battle of Leyte Gulf presented an even more dramatic demonstration of American medical capabilities. On November 12, 1944, LSTH-464 admitted 137 casualties from 3 ships attacked by kamikaze pilots. The medical bay overflowed with burned and mangled bodies as surgical teams worked around the clock. Dr. Morrison and his colleagues performed operations while their ship maneuvered under continued air attack. The psychological pressure on medical personnel was immense. They could hear the roar of approaching aircraft engines, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns, and the screaming of wounded men. Yet they maintained focus on their surgical procedures, knowing that any distraction could cost a patient's life. Nurses held patients steady during bombing runs while surgeons continued their work. Corpsmen administered blood transfusions even as the ship's guns fired overhead. Japanese pilots targeting the LST could see medical personnel through the ship, as open hatches and ports. Many reported astonishment at witnessing enemy medical teams continuing their work despite obvious danger. Some pilots hesitated to attack vessels where they could clearly observe medical activities, creating tactical advantages for American forces. The November 14th admission of 125 additional casualties pushed LSTH-464's medical facilities beyond all design limits. Every available space became a treatment area as medical personnel improvised solutions to impossible challenges. They performed surgery in converted storage compartments, established triage areas and ammunition magazines, and created recovery wards in former troop quarters. The ultimate test of American medical resolve came on April 28, 1945, when a Japanese kamikaze pilot deliberately targeted USS Comfort near Okinawa. The pilot aimed his aircraft directly at the massive red cross painted on the hospital ship's hull, as if using the international symbol of medical neutrality as a targeting device. The attack represented a fundamental violation of the Geneva Convention and demonstrated Japanese desperation as their military situation deteriorated. The kamikaze struck the heart of the hospital ship at 1945 hours, plunging through multiple decks before exploding in the surgical ward. 6 nurses, 4 surgeons, and 7 patients died instantly in the blast. The explosion ignited aviation fuel that created a massive fireball, killing 30 total personnel and wounding 48 others. Chief Nurse Lieutenant Ruth Howard was blown against a bulkhead, suffering spinal injuries and temporary hearing loss. Despite the catastrophic damage and abandoned ship orders, Howard refused to leave her post. She had witnessed the destruction of the ship's main surgical facilities and knew that critically wounded patients faced certain death without immediate medical attention. Her decision to remain represented the moral courage that defined American military medicine throughout the Pacific War. The medical staff aboard Comfort faced an impossible situation. Their primary surgical suite was destroyed, their X-ray and laboratory facilities were wrecked, and many of their colleagues were dead or wounded. Yet wounded personnel continued arriving from other ships in the task force. The medical team made a remarkable decision. They would continue operating using whatever spaces and equipment remained functional. Within hours of the attack, medical personnel had converted the ship's mess hall into an emergency operating room. The barber shop became a first aid station where corpsmen treated less serious injuries. Undamaged equipment was relocated from destroyed compartments to create functional medical spaces. This impromptu medical facility began receiving and treating casualties even as damage control teams fought fires and pumped out flooding compartments. Japanese radio intercepts revealed confusion and disbelief among enemy commanders monitoring American communications. They heard reports of continued medical operations aboard the supposedly crippled hospital ship. Intelligence analysts struggled to understand how American medical personnel could maintain such dedication after suffering such devastating losses. The broader implications of these medical operations began affecting Japanese military morale throughout the Pacific theater. Word spread among Japanese units that American forces would continue medical operations even under the most extreme conditions. This knowledge created psychological pressure on Japanese personnel who had been taught that capture meant certain death or torture. Captain Ayeri Abe, a Japanese naval intelligence officer captured near Okinawa, later testified about the impact of American medical capabilities on Japanese fighting spirit. He described growing awareness among Japanese officers that American medical personnel treated enemy prisoners with the same dedication they showed to their own wounded. This realization contradicted years of military indoctrination about American character and values. The transformation of Japanese perceptions accelerated as more personnel witnessed American medical operations firsthand. Prisoner of war camps became centers of cultural exchange where Japanese medical personnel observed American techniques and philosophies. Many expressed amazement at the resources dedicated to preserving life, contrasting sharply with their own military's approach to battlefield medicine. The statistical impact of American naval medical innovations during the Pacific War revealed the true magnitude of this medical revolution. LSTH 464 alone treated 8,236 hospital inpatients and 15,271 outpatients during her service, performing 655 major operations and 381 minor procedures. These numbers represented thousands of lives saved that would have been lost under traditional medical evacuation systems. Survival rates for combat casualties reached unprecedented levels as forward surgical capabilities eliminated the golden hour problem that had plagued military medicine for centuries. Wounded personnel who would have died during long evacuations to rear area hospitals now received immediate life-saving surgery within minutes of injury. The American medical system achieved casualty survival rates exceeding 95% for personnel who reached medical facilities alive. Japanese prisoners of war provided the most revealing testimony about enemy perceptions of American medical capabilities. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, Capche, toured during the Battle of Iwo Jima, later described his astonishment at receiving immediate surgical treatment for shrapnel wounds. He had expected execution or torture based on Japanese military indoctrination about American character. Instead, he found himself in a clean hospital ward receiving the same quality care as American casualties. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto Keisuke, a Japanese naval intelligence officer captured near Okinawa, provided detailed accounts of changing Japanese perceptions throughout the war. He described initial Japanese dismissal of American medical efforts as evidence of cultural weakness and poor fighting spirit. This attitude gradually transformed as reports filtered back from prisoners and wounded personnel about the quality of American medical care. The psychological impact on Japanese fighting morale proved as significant as the immediate medical benefits for American forces. Japanese soldiers began surrendering in larger numbers as word spread about American medical treatment of prisoners. The knowledge that capture might lead to medical care rather than certain death influenced tactical decisions at squad and platoon levels throughout Japanese military units. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, acknowledged in post-war interviews that American medical capabilities had contributed to declining Japanese morale. He described intercepted American radio communications that revealed medical personnel continuing operations under extreme conditions. These intercepts contradicted Japanese assumptions about American character and military dedication. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical advantages. American medical innovations demonstrated industrial and technological capabilities that impressed neutral observers worldwide. Nations evaluating potential alliances closely watched American medical performance as an indicator of overall military competence and national commitment to military personnel. Medical personnel from Allied nations serving alongside American forces provided additional testimony about the impact of these innovations. British Royal Navy medical officers described their amazement at American surgical capabilities during joint operations. Australian military medical personnel adapted American techniques for use in their own forces, spreading American medical innovations throughout Allied military organizations. The long-term strategic implications of American naval medical innovations extended far beyond the immediate Pacific War context. Japanese military leaders, observing American medical capabilities through intelligence reports and prisoner testimonies, began reassessing their fundamental assumptions about American military character and industrial capacity. These medical demonstrations provided concrete evidence of American technological sophistication and resource allocation priorities. General Hideki Tojo, former Japanese prime minister and war minister, addressed these concerns in his post-war testimony before war crimes tribunals. He acknowledged that American medical capabilities had surprised Japanese military planners who had assumed that democratic societies lacked the discipline necessary for sustained military operations. The dedication of American medical personnel under combat conditions contradicted Japanese propaganda about American fighting spirit. The transformation of Japanese medical education and practice began during the occupation period as American medical personnel shared their techniques and philosophies with Japanese counterparts. Dr. Yoshio Nakata, director of Tokyo Imperial University Medical School, later described the profound impact of American medical approaches on Japanese civilian medicine. American emphasis on aggressive life-saving measures and advanced surgical techniques revolutionized Japanese medical practice. American medical innovations influenced post-war military medical development worldwide as Allied nations incorporated lessons learned from Pacific operations. The concept of forward surgical teams operating under combat conditions became standard doctrine for NATO medical planning. Mobile surgical capabilities became integral to Cold War military medical preparations as other nations sought to replicate American innovations. The moral authority demonstrated by American medical personnel during the Pacific War contributed to broader American diplomatic influence during the post-war Reconstruction period. Japanese civilians, learning about American medical treatment of Japanese military personnel, developed more favorable attitudes toward American occupation policies. This soft power influence facilitated political and economic reforms throughout Japanese society. The technological advances pioneered by American naval medical units found applications in civilian medical practice during the post-war economic boom. Techniques developed for treating trauma under extreme conditions improved emergency medical care in American hospitals. Equipment innovations designed for combat medical applications enhanced civilian surgical capabilities and patient outcomes. The cultural exchange initiated by American medical personnel continued through formal educational programs that brought Japanese medical professionals to American institutions for advanced training. These programs created lasting professional relationships that facilitated ongoing medical cooperation between American and Japanese medical communities. Many Japanese physicians who observed American medical capabilities during the war became advocates for medical cooperation during the Reconstruction period. The precedent established by American military medical ethics during the Pacific War influenced international humanitarian law development during the post-war period. The Geneva Conventions were expanded to include stronger protections for medical personnel and facilities, partially based on American practices during World War II. The moral standards demonstrated by American medical personnel became benchmarks for international military medical conduct. The strategic vindication of American medical philosophy occurred as other nations adopted similar approaches to military medicine, recognizing the tactical and strategic advantages of aggressive life-saving measures. The American investment in military medical capabilities proved its value not only in lives saved, but in broader military and diplomatic advantages that extended far beyond the immediate war context. The story of American naval medical operations during the Pacific War represents more than just medical innovation. It reveals fundamental truths about the relationship between values, technology, and military effectiveness. When Japanese officers first witnessed American medical personnel performing surgery while under enemy fire, they encountered something that challenged their basic assumptions about warfare, culture, and human nature. The dedication of medical personnel like Dr. Arthur White, who continued operating despite his own injuries aboard the burning Lexington, or Chief Nurse Ruth Howard, who refused to abandon her patients even after USS Comfort was struck by a kamikaze, demonstrated moral courage that transcended military doctrine. These individuals embodied values that proved as powerful as any weapon in the American arsenal. The technological innovations that enabled surgery under combat conditions reflected broader American industrial and scientific capabilities that Japanese planners had underestimated. The conversion of LSTs into floating hospitals, the development of mobile blood banks, and the integration of advanced medical equipment into combat vessels demonstrated problem-solving abilities that applied to every aspect of warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the American approach to military medicine revealed a fundamental respect for human life that distinguished democratic societies from their authoritarian opponents. Where Japanese military doctrine accepted casualties as inevitable, American innovation sought to save every possible life. This philosophical difference created tactical and strategic advantages that contributed to ultimate victory. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel who witnessed or experienced American medical capabilities cannot be overstated. Many discovered that their military indoctrination about American character was fundamentally wrong. This realization contributed to changing attitudes that facilitated post-war reconciliation and cooperation between former enemies. The legacy of these medical innovations continues today in military medical doctrine worldwide. The concept of forward surgical teams, the integration of medical capabilities into combat units, and the moral imperative to preserve life under extreme conditions all trace their origins to those desperate hours when American medical personnel proved that healing and fighting could coexist on the same battlefield. In the end, Japanese officers learned that American medics could indeed operate surgery while ships were under attack. And in learning this, they discovered something profound about the nation they had chosen to fight.